watched as 4 men broke a hole in a roof to get their friend to Jesus, because they were going to do anything they could to get their friend to him. And it's a wonderful story. It's a vivid story that has so many different elements to it. This man who had been a paralytic walks out under his own strength. I can still hear the gasps of the crowd, can't you, as they saw this take place, and how they all proclaimed that I've never seen anything like this. And in the midst of all of that, Jesus is sitting there. I can just see him smiling, can't you? I mean, he's just taking it all in. He's teaching with words, but he's also teaching with acts of love. I love how we're reminded in that story that Jesus can touch our deepest needs. That's what we were thinking about last week. And how we're called then to be stretcher bearers, bringing other people to Jesus. Well, this morning, we're going to continue in the Gospel of Mark. In fact, we don't even skip a verse. We just heard it read by Ellie and Colin, the story of Levi's call. And once again, what we're going to see is an outsider restored. One who was seen beyond the grace of God, redeemed. And this time, Jesus is in maybe a more familiar place, because this time he's down by the Sea of Galilee. It was where it seems like so often we find him operating. It was there that he had first called Peter and Andrew and James and John. And in many ways, this text mirrors that in some of the earlier encounters. He's come to this beautiful place, and this large crowd begins to gather around him. And once again, he begins to teach. And you get the sense almost that this is his classroom. This is where he likes to do his teaching. Along the lakefront. You remember the other occasion where he got in a boat and pushed out so that the crowds could hear him. But here, what's recorded is not his words, but his actions. I guess it's a great reminder that our actions speak louder than our words, right? And it's in this story, instead of someone pushing their way through the crowd, that in a sense, Jesus does that. He pushes his way through the crowd to get to Levi. We're told that he sees this tax collector. He's on the job. He's at his collection booth. He's doing his business, doing what he's doing. And Jesus comes to him and calls him to follow him. I don't know about you, but I've been thinking about that this week as I've been studying this passage. How Levi probably would never have considered entering the house where Jesus had been last week, remember? I mean, can you imagine him getting up on the roof and tearing a hole in the roof? They'd lynched him. I mean, tax collectors were seen as traitors. They were individuals who had, in a sense, sold their soul to the enemies of Israel, and they were working on their behalf. They stole from their own people, enabled and facilitated Roman rule, and then profited from it. And while they were only required to collect this much, they collected much more so that they could line their own pockets. They were dishonest brokers in a broken system. They were leeches. Tax collecting was not simply seen as an undesirable job. It was seen as evil by the culture that's surrounded by the people of Israel. All through the New Testament, we see this phrase, don't we? Tax collectors and sinners. And it's not like he's trying to set up two different groups of people. He's suggesting that they're one in and of the same. To connect tax collectors and sinners was not meant to suggest a difference. He was trying to say that they were equated with one another. In fact, in Luke 18, we're privy to the prayers of a Pharisee. And he says this, he says, "Pray God, I thank you that I'm not like other people." Doesn't that? Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like tax collectors. And yet, what do we see? We see Jesus calling this tax collector. I mean, what is that about? I mean, last week, his first words to a paralytic were, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And here we have Jesus inviting Levi the tax collector to follow after him. Maybe you're thinking, well, that's what Jesus does, isn't it? He does things like this. But this is not, and maybe some of you are thinking, well, this was just kind of a one-off thing, but it's not, is it? Even Tim mentioned Zacchaeus. You see, Jesus is always seeking to save those who are lost. And those are not my words. Those come from the Gospel of Luke. You see, one of the things I'm discovering is that Jesus is never looking to distance himself from anyone. From sinners, from outcasts, from outsiders, from Pharisees, from anyone. He's not looking to distance himself from you or me either. He always wades into the waters and engages in ways that we might find hard to believe, which begs the question, and this is the question that I've been thinking about. Why did Jesus call Levi to follow after him? I mean, why not simply say, Levi, I want you to know, because you're a tax collector and a sinner, that you're forgiven. He didn't say that to the paralytic. Why didn't he say the same thing? I mean, it would certainly fit right here, right? And I think the answer to that question is profound, and it's important for us to consider. You see, I believe that Jesus saw something in Levi, and it's not what you think. I believe he saw the image of his Father. He saw the image of God in him. He recognized that Levi, for all the mess that was his life, for all the bad decisions that he had made, for all the awful choices, that Levi was not beyond the grace of God. That he was fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, I don't know about you, but I struggle some with this. You see, more often than not, it's hard to look beyond the sin, isn't it? We're good at seeing the stain on the shirt, if you get my drift. The flaw instead of the person. We're good at pointing out the things that didn't work instead of the things that do. And we do that to people too. But you see, for Jesus, there is no stain, no flaw, no nothing, no matter how debilitating, that hides or changes the reality that all of us are created in the image of God and are redeemable. There is no one who is beyond his love, not even you or me. At this table, we're reminded of that too, aren't we? As Jesus called Levi, he calls to each of us, and he longs for us so much so that he pushes through the crowds to get to us, to call us, because he sees in us his image. And he sees that even all the bad choices that I've made, all the things that I've done wrong, that he looks beyond that, and he still calls me. That's a miracle. That I'm your pastor. Because I can be redeemed. Because God can redeem anyone. Because we are all fearfully and wonderfully made. And we read in our story that having called Levi to follow after him, like he called James and John and Andrew and Peter, Jesus is found now following Levi to his home, to his table. Can you imagine? There he is, Jesus, with those other with his disciples, his new disciples, Andrew and Peter, James and John. They're just following him along the way, and they walk into his house and sit at the table, and there's Levi as well. And now all these other friends of Levi are there. And let's face it, the only friends that Levi was going to have were people who were probably in a similar place. Because when you're a tax collector, you're lumped with those people. And this was a huge, huge problem for some of the people who were on looking and watching what was going on. The Pharisees specifically. They're heard saying, why does Jesus eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now, you have to understand, Pharisees were holiness folk, which is probably not the language that we'd like to hear, because we kind of see ourselves as Nazarenes, as holiness folk. We see this group of individuals, these Pharisees, as self-righteous and far from God. But I would remind you that in their day, they were seen as some of the very best of God's people. They were the ones that you would nominate for leadership positions. They were the ones that were seen as protectors of the faith, keeping it from becoming contaminated, whatever that means. They understood the holiness is best preserved through separation. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan? You know, those guys didn't go to the other side of the road because they were just mean. They went to the other side of the road because they thought, if I go and touch him, I'll be contaminated and I won't be able to do what God has called me to do. And Jesus in that story shows that, you know, holiness is being a neighbor. Holiness is loving the other. Holiness is love. Unfortunately, these Pharisees believed that you were holy by how you were set apart. And as they watched Jesus reclining with Levi and his sinful friends, they were genuinely confused. I mean, to eat with sinners in their mind was just stupid. It was dangerous. It was sinful. It was a risk to your holiness. It was certainly not what a truly holy person would do. And you might say that their question suggests that Jesus wasn't the holy person that others were suggesting he was. It's kind of like when somebody comes up to you and says, hey, what's going on with, so-and-so? I saw them walk into... And in that question, there's this assumption, isn't it, that holy people, that good people, that right people don't do that. And this was the issue that the Pharisees had with what they saw. Jesus was rubbing shoulders with, tax collectors, sinners. And we all know what happens when you do that. It's not pretty. And Jesus, just like last week, seems to know what has been said, doesn't he? Well, actually, he hears this time. And in hearing their question, he says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor. It's the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus was suggesting something that we need to grapple with as his followers. Remember that we are called to walk as Jesus walked. Now, I don't think anybody would have a problem with what Jesus says, at least the logic of it. I mean, to use another metaphor, where do you need a light? Where it's dark, right? I mean, that makes sense. The struggle that we have with what Jesus says, it requires more than we simply just hear those words or even assent to them. It requires that we live into them. It suggests that we should be more interested in saving people than protecting our reputation as holiness people. We in the church should be more into building bridges than making sure everyone knows that we'd never be caught doing this or there. Unfortunately, so often I find that we buy into the logic of the Pharisees. And so as our society becomes more and more secular, instead of engaging it, what do? We withdraw. We become separate. We fear for our kids. And so we gather them in a room with our little lights, and we pray for Jesus to come back, instead of helping our kids know how to live in the dark for Christ. And I get it. But as I read this story, I get the sense that Jesus would call us to say, don't be afraid. He would remind us that he who is with us is greater than he that is in the world. Besides, those around us, those that we rub shoulders with in the shops and on the streets, guess what? They're made in the image of God. They too are fearfully and wonderfully made. These Pharisees, they were so concerned about what Jesus was doing. Actually, they probably thought he was already contaminated, because they had no idea that true holiness is defined not by separation, but by love. It's not what I'm against, it's what I'm for. You see, we confuse the call to not love the world or anything in the world as a call to not love the world or anything in the world. Because remember, God so loved the world. And he didn't just love perfect people. He didn't just love us. He loves all people. He loves each one of us. Tax collectors, sinners, adulterers, homosexuals, prostitutes. He loves everyone. I mean, can we do any less? I think how Levi would never have come to the house where Jesus was teaching, like I said before. So Jesus, what does he do? He comes to him, even joining Levi's friends at the table. Again, can we do any less? Sometimes I think it's unfortunate, sometimes in the church, that we are so busy that the only people we spend time with are Christians, other believers. I don't know where we got the idea that that's a good idea. I think it's good that we come together. Don't get me wrong. I'm a pastor, for crying out loud. And, I'd really like for you to show up on Sundays. It really is. It's a lot more fun to preach to people than to preach to empty chairs. Trust me, I experienced that during Zoom. It's not fun to just preach in a building that's empty. But I believe that Jesus wants us to walk into people's lives. And he wants us to be involved in people's lives. And where last week we saw someone being brought to Jesus, this week we see Jesus come. Sometimes we're called to invite people into our world, and sometimes the call is to go into theirs, to join their party, to come around their table. Well, this morning, in a moment, we're going to be invited to this table, to his table. And we're not being invited because we have it all together. We're being invited because of grace. Truth is, we all started on the outside looking in, like that song that we were singing a moment ago said. But thanks be to God, he calls us to come and find redemption. As Tim and Amanda come and lead us, I want you to ponder two things. First, the grace that is offered to you. Maybe you wonder how in the world that can be true for you. But I want you to know that Jesus would push his way through any crowd to get to you, because he longs for you to join him at his table, to show you his redeeming love. Secondly, I want you to think about where God might lead you to walk. What crowd he might ask you to push through, to share his love. It's so easy, isn't it, to see only the stain of sin and to miss the fingerprints of our Creator. I don't know about you, but I am so thankful that Jesus pushed his way through a crowd to get to me. So let's come to the table and let's sing as we prepare to come.